Hello, everybody. I'm Frank Morano. Friday afternoon. If you're a night owl and you normally listen to me on the radio, you know this is the very beginning of my day. So I want you to have very measured expectations for my portion of the conversation that you're about to hear, because this is what it would be like for a normal person to start speaking and be expected to think coherently at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes you have to shake off the cobwebs a little bit. Fortunately, the gentleman that I'm talking to is able to think clearly no matter what his state of consciousness or sobriety. I had Alan Tonelson on the radio this week. We had a wide-ranging discussion about tariffs and the economy in general and a few other areas. The only real complaint that we had to this interview, even with people that ended up disagreeing with some of Alan's opinions, was that it was way too short. So Alan has graciously agreed to do a part two as we explore just a stone's throw from the election. I don't know that anybody in media has ever done this before, but we're actually making an effort to look at policy. Now, I know, what does a policy have to do with election? Elections are about gaffes, poll numbers, fundraising, and comparing people to Hitler. So we're not sure if anyone has ever actually discussed policy in the run-up to an election, but we're going to try it and see if the world doesn't stop spinning on its axis. Very, very pleased to welcome Alan Tonelson. Alan, it is great to talk with you. It's great to see you.
Frank, terrific to see you too, and you certainly seem wide awake to me.
All right. Well, a lot of folks watching, and normally videos like this that we do, we generally just make available to a few number of subscribers, but we're making this one available to everybody because I think it's an important discussion. And while we're talking here, if people have questions, you can just type them in the comments and we'll try and answer. Well, Alan will be the one answering. Alan will try to answer as many of these questions as we can. And, if I don't see your question, just hang tight and we'll get to you. All right, Alan, just to kind of put a button on our discussion the other day about the idea of tariffs in general. The one thing that left-wing media outlets like the New York Times and the right-wing media outlets like Wall Street Journal seem to agree upon is that tariffs will be tariffs in general, but especially the Trump broad-based untargeted tariffs are going to be inflationary. Here's a headline in CNBC, but it could have easily come from The Hill or 900 other papers. This is just 2 days ago. Trump tariffs likely to lead to higher U.S. interest rates. And then there's all sorts of other fears that tariffs would be inflationary. As far as you're concerned, would tariffs lead to greater inflation?
Frank, you're absolutely right that these kinds of predictions have become standard operating procedure for the really overwhelmingly anti-Trump regime media. But and it is important to acknowledge that the kinds of tariffs that Trump's been talking about during the campaign would be substantially higher and broader than the tariffs that he did put into effect when he was president. At the same time, he has also advanced an awfully interesting notion about why the tariffs won't be very inflationary, if inflationary at all, because he's argued that high tariff walls around the U.S. economy will create strong incentives both for U.S. multinational companies that produce their products overseas to send them back to the U.S. market, and for foreign companies who do the same thing to come back into the U.S. in order to cut costs. And I think that's an awfully interesting argument. A lot will depend on how high the actual tariffs are. Trump has also pointed out that he's proposing that the corporate income tax be reduced from the current, as I recall, 21% to 15%, which will also save costs for companies that move their production and jobs from overseas to the United States. So, you're going to have, in theory anyway, some very big cost reductions for companies that take their cues from the Trump tariffs that could, in principle, and I do have to emphasize in principle, they could offset much or all of the cost increases created by the higher tariffs. And that in turn would significantly boost the production of these products in the United States economy, their availability to US consumers, and the increased supply could well keep a lid on prices. Now, again, this would be quite an experiment, but I consider it to be pretty promising.
By the way, for people that are unfamiliar with your background and didn't hear our conversation the other day, by the way, I encourage everybody to go back and listen to our conversation from Thursday morning. They can get the podcast at fmwabc.com or just searching in any podcast app, Frank Morano Interviews and More. People should absolutely check out your blog, Reality Check. We have the address at the bottom of the screen there. It's alantonelson.wordpress.com. How did you get into the habit of commenting on the economy, world affairs, things of that nature? You don't necessarily have the typical Paul Krugman-esque economic / political pundit background.
Well, I certainly don't, and I'm actually somewhat proud of that. I don't want to make too much of that, but I'm somewhat proud of that. And I began my career many decades ago, as it turns out, writing and reporting about foreign policy issues, international affairs, and I continued that up through the early 1980s at Foreign Policy magazine, which is one of the two leading journals of U.S. foreign policy in the United States, the other one being a journal called Foreign Affairs. And it became clear to me as I continued in this job and read the articles that all the supposed experts were sending into us, that you really couldn't understand a great deal, even at that point, about U.S. foreign policy unless you understood its relationship to the U.S. domestic economy and to the global economy as well. And so I began investigating these links much more intensively. And then by the early 90s, I was convinced that economics were, in fact, a major driving force for U.S. foreign policy, and that foreign policy was also in turn affecting the kinds of international economic policies that this country had been following, which until that point had been down the line free trade for two main reasons. One, because certainly until the mid 1970s, the U.S. economy was so much bigger and stronger than anybody else's, that American leaders really didn't have to think too much about trade policy and about international economic policy, and the costs of free trade, even with countries that by no means practice free trade, seem to be pretty marginal. And second, in particular, they seem pretty marginal in relation to the perceived need to keep these countries out of the Soviet Union's orbit. Mm-hmm. And to protect them from Soviet advances, from communist influence, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the big problem turned out to be that even after the Soviet Union collapsed and communism became largely discredited all over the world, we still continued to carry out these so-called free trade policies, even despite the fact that the U.S. economy relative to the rest of the world's economy had become weaker, and the costs of these free trade policies had grown higher and higher. But this hangover from the Cold War continued.
Yeah, no, I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense and it's totally logical. And I don't understand why we were addicted to this free trade ideology as a country for as long as we have been in both parties.
And that's, by the way, Frank, a really key point in both parties. Both parties were down the line on this, certainly until Donald Trump's first presidential campaign began.
Yeah, no doubt about it. If you opposed the idea of free trade, you were considered a fringe character. The
Hmm.
only guys, weirdos like Pat Buchanan, Ralph Nader, and Ross Perot would even dare question
Hmm.
the wisdom of free trade, even though that's primarily what the country adhered to, meaning protectionism for most of our history. For your naysayers, um they'll point out, and this is even mentioned in your Wikipedia, no doubt put in there by your naysayers, that you have no formal training in economics and have never published a paper in a peer-reviewed economics journal. What do you say to that? Why should people listen to you that doesn't have the PhD in economics before, say, a Paul Krugman or the Wall Street Journal editorial page?
I not only don't have a PhD in economics, I have no master's and no bachelor's degree either. But I've learned a great deal from talking to economists who I've worked with for many, many years, who have very respectable credentials. And they have in fact, um, taught me a great deal. And aside from all of that credentials based stuff, I would just ask naysayers to read what I write, see how it compares with the facts as they know it, and in fact, as they exist, and come to their own judgment. And if they feel that I've fallen short, they certainly have a right to their opinion, but I would really much rather be judged on the facts
Yeah.
and on my own work than on what people think that my resume indicates.
All right. If people are watching and they have comments or questions, type them
Mhm.
in the comments and we'll try and answer as many of your questions as we can. Those of you that are watching, as you're watching, please be so good as to share this video so that other people can be part of the discussion or at least see the discussion as well.
By the
Um,
way, Frank, if I could, I'd like to make one more brief point, and that
sure.
is that all of those highly credentialed economists who have been very critical of opinions like mine, they missed the global financial crisis, they missed the housing bubble, and they missed the growing and now extremely serious dangers of rapidly expanding trade and investment with China. And they miss not only the economic consequences, they miss the national security consequences.
So, were we, in hindsight, one of the great accomplishments that Nixon and his team are very proud of is opening up China and moving forward with trade with Maoist China. Through the prism of hindsight, seeing where we are now as a country, was it a mistake for the United States to essentially abandon Taiwan and abandon diplomatic relations with Taiwan in order to pursue the one China policy with communist China?
I think in hindsight, the big mistake was really carrying this policy way too far and permitting the interests of offshoring happy multinational corporations eventually to drive this policy. Certainly by the 1990s, when they began pressuring the United States to not only continue expanding trade and investment with China, but to let China into the World Trade Organization, which would have provided major protections for China against any attempts by the U.S. government to, as the cliche goes, level the playing field. Because even by then, China was a completely predatory trade power. Um, they simply carried this China opening, which, in the context of the early 70s, when it was pursued by Nixon and by Henry Kissinger, made a lot of sense. You wanted to give the Soviet Union something big to worry about aside from us. That was fine. And in principle, a very smartly balanced policy focusing both on economics and on geopolitics could have been very successful, but the balance was lost pretty darn quickly.
All right. In a minute, I want to bring in my buddy Paul, who has a question or a couple of
Mhm.
questions for you. But I got to ask you about this. Everybody's talking about this. New York Times headline. It's covered in a number of papers, though. Trump flirts with the ultimate income, the ultimate tax cut, no income taxes at all. The former president has repeatedly praised a period in American history when there was no income tax and the country relied on tariffs to fund the government. This has led to folks like Ron Paul, Peter Schiff to tweet this and saying, now, boy, this would really make the country great again. As far as you're concerned, Alan, is this practical? Is this possible to go back to where we were prior to 1916 and do away with the income tax and fund government operations entirely with tariffs and excise taxes?
I think everybody should be really skeptical about this. But I do think what's been overlooked is that there is a pretty significant potential to replace much of the income tax system with a very broad tariff that would be called a border adjustment tax, which would be pretty similar to a tax called the value added tax that practically every other country that the United States trades with, including practically all of the major economies in the world, have in effect. And what I find fascinating about this is that this version of the value added tax, which basically subsidizes U.S. exports overseas and penalizes imports coming in, this version of the value added tax that's specifically called a border adjustment tax has been supported in the past, and in the very recent past, by the way, by big multinational manufacturers like Boeing and by so-called rhino Republicans like Paul Ryan. And one of the big mysteries to me surrounding Trump's presidency was his reluctance to take this very seriously. I think it should be taken extremely seriously, and I was very pleased to see, I believe it was in the New York Post about a week or two ago, two Heritage Foundation economists endorse this very proposal. And the Heritage Foundation, by the way, for most of its existence, has been extremely anti-tariff.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting as well. I spent a lot of time on it 7 years ago when they were batting this around. And if time permits, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the value added tax and the bat in a little bit. By the way, people are commenting. John Kwok, who is a tough critic, says this is an excellent discussion, Frank and Alan. And my brother-in-law, Josh, who's not quite as tough as a critic, at least when it comes to us, he says 100%. And folks are also commenting. We'll get to as many of these comments as possible. But I want to bring in Paul Sarian. Paul Sarian is a retired police captain, but also a big observer of world affairs and a regular viewer, a regular listener of our show, and has a pretty good head on his shoulders. Hey there, Paul.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing great. Is that the conference house behind you?
Yeah.
Well done. Well done. Alan, I'm not sure how much time you spent on Staten Island, but the conference house was the site of a meeting in 1776, September 11, 1776, between Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge, and Lord William Howe in an attempt to bring an end to the hostilities of the Revolutionary War.
Fascinating.
It did not end up working, but we got a great house and a little museum out of it. So it's wonderful. All right, Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay. Now I found out that you're going to be on the show just yesterday. I know you were on a radio show a couple of days ago. So I just kind of like put together a whole bunch of notes and references. I have a lot of different things I'd like to touch on. I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to try to stay on the issues. Some of my background, he mentioned I was police captain, 24 years of the NYPD. But before that, in my previous life, I worked on Wall Street for 5 years. And so although I'm not an economist, like I said, I worked on Wall Street. I worked in COMEX for 4 years on the floor of the commodity exchange. And the very first day that I got on COMEX was in the first week of January. That's when silver peaked at almost $50 an ounce. So I got I was baptized by fire. I saw what was the result of the Hunt brothers, Nelson Bunker Hunt and his brother, and a Saudi Arabian prince, I can't recall his name right now, who got together and they summarily cornered the silver market back in the 1970s. And as soon as I got on the forward exchange in January, that's when it peaked. And I saw silver go from almost $50 an ounce to $10 an ounce within a week. It was incredible. And it was like, the commodity exchange is like crazy back in those days that they had the open outcry. It was very exciting. It was like going to a Yankee game every single day. And that day was the World Series of World Series, and people made a lot of money and people lost a lot of money. The reason why I bring that up is because tariffs has everything to do about commodities, not just gold and silver. Of course, that's a key player right now because everybody's talking about going back on a gold standards and all that. But I'm going to touch on what you spoke about when in the 1970s, Nixon and
John Connolly.
Right. They brought China into the fold.
Okay.
And they were trying
Kissinger, actually, not John Connolly. I thought you were talking about something else. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Nixon and the Secretary of State, Kissinger.
Yeah.
They pretty much brought China into the fold for the purpose of creating a balance of power between Russia and China during the Cold War times. That was the ultimate way of, that yin and yang and that pro and con and that. So to keep everything copacetic and, like you said, you alluded to that, it was kind of like the balance of power. Now, I agree with you on a lot of things when it comes to the tariffs and how we need open trade. And I think I have questions. I have some comments, but I don't want to talk too long. What I want to ask you now is, and I have my own answer, I think it's going to agree with yours, is how has the United States failed by increasing tariffs on all of these countries and sanctions on all of these countries, such as Russia and China?
Well, a main reason that we failed, and I think the most important reason in terms of what the policy-making process has been like, and I'm usually not a big process guy, but I think it's been really important here, and that is that you've got very powerful multinational business interests. I mean, I hate to sound conspiratorial, but this is what happens. Very powerful US-based business interests have basically bought US trade policy for decades, and they were very frustrated when Trump came into office, and even when Trump was running for office at first, and when it first became clear that he might very well win, they were just absolutely panicked. They had been in the driver's seat for decades, and not only by making big campaign contributions to politicians in both parties, but by funding think tanks in Washington that produced reams and reams of research that strongly influenced the mainstream media, which essentially became their mouthpiece. And it looked like, and as Frank alluded to near the start of the show, it looked like every reasonable, successful person in this country was an anti-tariff, pro-free trade person, and that if you disagreed, there was something wrong with you, or you were some kind of a fringe crank.
I want to come up with my conclusion, with the ultimate hubris of raising tariffs, and that is we accomplished what Russia and China were not able to accomplish without our raising tariffs, and that is they are now unified. And let me take it a couple of steps further. We've also accomplished the same thing with the balance of power that we created between China and India by raising tariffs on China. And we also created a more powerful and economically stable Iran. Their gross domestic product, their real gross domestic product is twice ours. Real gross domestic, not nominal, real, is twice ours. We don't know that. We're in the dark about that. They are doing economically twice as good as we are. And why is all this happening? While we're doing sanctions and tariffs, because it's failing. We're failing. We are no longer the superpower empire that we were back in the 70s and 60s.
So let me get Alan to respond there, Paul. A lot of good points.
Sure.
Okay. Well, first of all, Paul, I really do want to thank you for your service as a police captain. I mean, that's just I'm always incredibly impressed with our first responders, and so hats off to you on that score. I mean, there's no question that relative to the rest of the world, the United States is less successful. It's weaker militarily. It's weaker economically than it was back in the 1970s. I think a big part of that was the inevitable comeback of Western Europe and also Japan from World War II devastation. I think that that clearly, on the whole, that was a very welcome development. We don't want to be this island of prosperity in a world of desperate poverty. But at the same time, as I tried to argue a little bit earlier, we failed to realize, or we didn't want to realize, let's maybe put it that way, that by the mid-1980s, Japan and Western Europe had essentially caught up, and that a different approach was needed. They no longer needed foreign aid as such. They no longer needed such heavy military protection because they were increasingly capable of defending themselves, and they no longer needed foreign aid in the form of unbalanced trade, where they were free to make money by selling into this market, and we were not nearly so free to make money by selling into their market. So I certainly am with you on that point, and to a very great extent, the what you might call the globalist anti-America first crowd really hasn't woken up to that yet. And I think they really don't want to wake up to that yet. Again, part of it is, I think, what they perceive to be their short-term interests and simple greed. And part of it is just intellectual inertia. There's a big hangover. It's often very difficult for people to change their minds from very deeply held convictions, and it really has taken a bull in a china shop like figure like Trump to start to shake them out of it. And in fact, some have begun to turn over the last roughly 8 years, not nearly quickly enough, not nearly completely enough, but it has started, and I'm certainly hoping that will continue, and that if he is elected president, that they will start losing some of their Trump derangement syndrome, at least when it comes to specific policy issues like this, not his personality, et cetera, but specific policy issues like this.
All right, Paul, stick around if you want. A couple other areas that I want to go over with you, Alan, where you've written a great deal about the situation in Eastern Europe, the war in Ukraine. Now there are reports that there are North Korean troops that are actually fighting with the Russians in Ukraine. This would seem to be a major escalation. First, do you believe that? Do you believe those reports are accurate? Because honestly, when it comes to Western media reporting on anything having to do with Russia, I'm pretty skeptical because it seems like the first instinct that the press has is to put the most hysterical headline out there. And if they could find someone in the intelligence community to be quoted anonymously, that gives the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal license to put it on its front page. Second, if that is true, that the North Koreans are fighting with the Russians in Ukraine, what does that mean for the present conflict and kind of U.S.-Sino relations going forward?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you that mainstream media reporting on most foreign policy issues comes from a very heavily biased pro-globalist. In fact, I would agree with Trump. America last perspective, and it's largely because of what these folks learned in school about Munich in 1938, about resisting Hitler. Once again, events that happened nearly 100 years ago when the world was completely different.
Mm-hmm.
Regarding the North Korean presence in Ukraine specifically, I would guess it's probably true. What I understand is that they're mostly training Russian soldiers to operate North Korean weapon systems. And I think it's actually, from a purely military balance standpoint, I think it's the North Korean weapons that are more important than any North Korean troop presence, because the North Koreans have a lot of really advanced weapons, and that could definitely affect the course of battle in Ukraine. But expanding out to a broader and I think much more important vantage point, I'm not only worried about Biden's policy toward Ukraine and about what looks to be Harris's policy toward Ukraine if she does become president. I'm scared stiff about this because it amounts to the United States courting the risk of nuclear war, which would make 9/11 look like a bump in the road, frankly, courting the risk of nuclear war with a nuclear superpower on behalf of a country that, however gallantly it's been fighting for the last 2.5 years, has never, ever been considered a vital U.S. national security interest by any president during the Cold War, whether they've been Republican or Democratic. It's too close to Russia. It's too close to Russian military power, and it's simply always been seen as marginal to us. And it's one thing to court the risk, as we do, to court the risk of nuclear war on behalf of big, important countries like the countries of Western Europe or certainly Japan. I'm not totally all in on that, but I see a reasonable rationale. To court nuclear war risk on behalf of a country you've never considered a vital interest is incredibly reckless, indeed bordering on insane, and it scares the living daylights out of me.
Well, same here.
And should scare everybody else too.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think that's an issue that certainly could have gotten a lot more attention in the current presidential campaign, and also a lot more nuanced attention, rather than treat characters like they're James Bond villains or modern day Churchills. But I'll save my critiques of the mainstream media for the 4 hours that I'm on in the middle of the night. Speaking of foreign policy, the other area that obviously has gotten a lot of attention is what's going on in the Middle East with Israel and initially Gaza, but now Lebanon and potentially Iran. So we saw this leaked assessment of Israeli plans to strike Iran. 3-part question, right? One, do you believe that this leak is genuine? Is it a genuine intelligence leak? 2, if these are in fact Israel's plans to strike Iran, what do you think that portends for the future of the current conflict in the Middle East? And lastly, who do you think leaked this document? Not what the person's name was, but what kind of person? An American, an Israeli, an intelligence official, a policy official, someone happy with the plans, someone unhappy with the plans? What kind of person do you think leaked it?
Well, I have no inside intelligence community information, whatever. But when incidents like this happen, I always ask myself, who benefits from this? And the answer to me clearly is the folks like President Biden who are terrified, and I think wrongly so in this case, who are terrified that any disproportionate, as they would call it, Israeli retaliation to practically any provocation by Iran, by Hamas, by Hezbollah, that any what they consider to be outsized Israeli retaliation will basically light the entire Middle East into flames and endanger global stability overall. And in this case, I'm deeply skeptical about this, and I do think this was leaked at the instructions that came from the very top, and I would not exclude President Biden at all, certainly Blinken, certainly Secretary of Defense Austin, and I think they were hoping this would put pressure on the Israelis to back down, to basically follow what's been the U.S. policy of retaliating against Iranian aggression, in particular with and here I would include Houthi aggression against Red Sea shipping with what are pretty much pinprick, tit for tat counterstrikes that have accomplished nothing in terms of deterring these two from acting badly.
Okay, I got to ask you about BRICS. Obviously, the BRICS summit is going on. What do you think this portends for the future of the global economy and for the future of the American economy and American national security?
I'll tell you, I think it portends not very much at all. And the reason is that, well, first of all, let's define the word BRICS, or the acronym BRICS. It's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. When the term was first coined in the 1990s during the enthusiastically pro-free trade, pro-globalization Clinton administration, it referred to countries that they considered to be emerging markets that were big already, that had cast off any notions that communism had anything useful to teach them, that were embracing free market reforms, and that were going to become major global economic powers and possibly major global military powers also. Now 30 or so years later, we see that with the exception of China and the partial exception of India, these countries have actually become weaker, not stronger. And once again, we're talking Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Even the Chinese economy is becoming much weaker. The Indian economy has made a lot of progress, although, as President Trump keeps pointing out, it's very protectionist economy. They're not free traders by a long shot. You've got South Africa as a very marginal player. I don't think anybody wants to call Russia an emerging market these days. And Brazil is also, pretty marginal. As former French leader Charles de Gaulle once said, Brazil's the country of the future and always will be. It just doesn't seem to pan out.
Paul's shaking his head no, so that tells me you've said something incorrect. Paul, go ahead, straighten Alan out here.
Like I said, I'm not an economist. Okay. So all I know is what I read on the internet, but there's a lot of public information from legitimate sources. Would you say that the IMF is a legitimate source?
Well, I think that the IMF puts out a lot of useful economic information, but their analysis is very free market oriented, very free trade oriented, and I think needs to be taken with a big grain of salt.
Okay, well, then take what I'm going to say with a grain of salt.
Okay.
The G7, it used to be G8, but they kicked out Russia,
right,
which is now a pariah state,
right,
as far as the G7 is concerned. Okay, let me give you the figures with the G7. The USA's GDP is 2.8%. This is all real. These are all real numbers.
This is real growth.
Real growth.
Right. Inflation-adjusted growth.
That's correct. Canada, 1.3%. France, 1.1%. Japan, 0.3%. UK, 1.1%. Italy, 0.7%. BRICS. Every single BRICS country, except for South Africa, has a higher real GDP than the United States.
No, they're growing faster. They're growing faster, but their economies are much smaller, except for China, which is catching up, unfortunately.
BRICS in total in totality represents at least half of the entire population of the entire world. And they have a gross domestic product of $60 trillion. So to say that they're just like growing economies that just kind of like, it's far greater than the United States. It's far greater than G7. And the population itself, in and of itself, just with the BRICS nation, is greater than almost half the entire world. So let me give you the figures for. Let me just.
Yeah.
Brazil, 3%, higher than the U.S. Russia, the Russia that we're trying to defeat in our proxy war in Ukraine, 3.6%, higher than the U.S. India, this rising nation, this just 7%,
right?
7%, almost 3 times as much as the United States. The one that's going down a little bit, like you said, is China. It's 4.8%, still almost double as the United States. But keep in mind, their future forecast for inflation is 0.4%. 0.4%. South Africa is the only country in BRICS nation that is lower than the United States at 1.1%. But South Africa is the truly developing nation that is that has a wealth of commodities that when it is explored and exploited in the right way by the other nations like China and Russia and Brazil, it's going to make BRICS the most powerful union that has ever existed in the history of mankind.
So, Paul, let me get Alan to respond because I want to go through one or two other issues before we run out of time here. Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, those are some compelling statistics there, Alan.
Okay. I guess just to be as brief as I can, the problem is that, these countries, they're growing rapidly, but from very low bases. So when you're starting from a low base, it's much easier to achieve rapid growth than when you're starting or continuing from a much higher base. Second, they're still full of very poor people overwhelmingly. When you divide their economic output, their GDPs, by their populations, it's still pretty low. And third, the United States, because it is so self-sufficient in so many products and raw materials and services already, and that could be substantially more self-sufficient if it didn't basically kick this enormous advantage, if it hadn't spent the last few decades, except for the Trump years, literally kicking away this enormous advantage that it holds over virtually every other country, would be substantially more self-sufficient. The United States simply needs commerce with these big countries, these big population countries, overwhelmingly much less than they need us. They need to export to the US market and to the world more generally desperately in order to keep growing. We don't need to export to them to keep growing. We're self-sufficient, which has many both economic and non-economic advantages, and we should be focusing on capitalizing on them and not kicking them away.
Alan, two other issues that I want to go over before we run out of time and I have to go pick up my son from school.
Okay.
Both are economic issues domestically. Okay. One, the Boeing strike. The striking Boeing workers have apparently rejected a new contract. The machinist strike is extending. How significant is this Boeing machinist strike? Where do you see it going? What are the implications for the American economy? And potentially, even given the fact that we're so dependent upon Boeing for both commercial aircraft, but for national security materials, what are the implications for national security for the country?
That's the overriding observation. That's the really important point, because Boeing has clearly been mismanaged in just about the worst possible way. Again, we're talking decades, and a major reason is that Boeing forgot that its wheelhouse is being outstanding in manufacturing, and like so many other big U.S. manufacturing companies, began to think of itself in terms of trying to achieve short-term results over everything else. It offshored production overseas, which is obviously how you offshore production, but it also sent lots of production to states like South Carolina, which are low-cost states. They're basically cheap labor states, although they're less cheap now. But South Carolina had absolutely no history or tradition or experience in manufacturing aircraft, and so which is a very complicated process involving so many sophisticated tasks that you can only build up through experience. Tasks like welding. This is not an easy thing to do, and inevitably, manufacturing issues just mushroomed and resulted in safety issues. And about the only point you can raise in the company's defense is that, like other transportation-oriented companies, it was hammered by the pandemic, travel shut down, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it's been so mismanaged. I don't blame the workers for holding out, because managers are sure being paid very well. In fact, for being grossly incompetent. But the first point, again, is the overriding point. Boeing is critical for national security and also for American economic power, and it's too big and too important and too strategic to fail.
Lastly, in terms of my questions, and then if people watching have a couple of comments, we'll try maybe do a lightning round. Just type your comments there. And if folks are watching on Facebook, please be so good as to share, and hopefully other people will see what we're doing. There's a Minnesota Congressman, Dean Phillips, who has proposed, he was obviously most noteworthy recently because he ran for president against President Biden. He's introduced a bill that would give each child $5,000 to start their savings and invest it in the S&P 500. They're calling these American Dream accounts. I've heard ideas like this from time to time over the last 15, 20 years. I'm sure it goes back much farther than that, from both Democrats and Republicans. What do you make of this idea, giving every child $5,000 to invest in the S&P 500? Good idea, bad idea? What do you think?
Just off the top of my head, because frankly, I was not aware of that. But I have seen ideas like this. They may have some merit to them. I think, though, that the very best way to make sure that today's children become prosperous and successful tomorrow is to invest in our primary school system. And of course, that involves not only spending more money on this country's public schools, which I think we would all agree at best have a very mixed record on this score, but we have to encourage much more innovation in primary and secondary school education. I think that's the real key. We seem to have lost the knack for that for all sorts of reasons that we could probably take a week's worth of shows to talk about. So again, just off the top of my head, it could have some promise. But we really need to get this country's primary and secondary school education act together.
Finally, Alan, give me two final predictions. We're going to hold you to both.
Right.
World Series, which starts tonight. Give me your predictions for who wins and how many games. And the presidential election. I won't pin you down to how many electoral votes, but
okay,
winner for that for me as well.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to say Yanks in 7, even though the Dodgers have the home field advantage, and they're an excellent team, except they've got some pretty shaky starting pitching. The Yankees have been kind of road warriors this year. Their big vulnerability has been they've been so maddeningly inconsistent, which has given me, near heart attacks for the whole season. But I'm going to say Yanks in 7. As far as the election goes, I got to say it's looking very good for Trump right now. And unless he makes a mind-bogglingly stupid statement, which of course you can't rule out. Unfortunately, you just can't rule that out. I think he's got it. The big danger, I think, is that Republicans and conservatives and other folks who are leaning toward Trump, let's say, they can't get too complacent about this. I think it's still very, very close.
Alan Tonelson, thank you. Paul Sarian, thank you for your contributions as well. Again, I want to remind folks that they can check out all of Alan's commentary at his blog, alantonelson.wordpress.com, or if you just go to Google and type in reality check, you can usually find it, especially if you put in Alan's name.
Oh, Frank, could I add one promotional point?
Please.
I also tweet like a house on fire, so I hope people want to follow me at @Alan Tonelson.
Perfect. I'm glad you mentioned that as well. All right. Thank you, Alan. Have a good weekend. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody who for watching. Please share this. I know a lot of people watch this at various times. Give a share with your own comments, your own opinions, everything that I said incorrectly, everything that Alan said incorrectly, everything that Paul said incorrectly. Once in a while, maybe there's even somebody that may agree with one of the three of us. You can feel free to share your own comments along with your thoughts. All right. Monday morning, got an interesting program on the radio. Former Controller General of the United States, Dave Walker, is going to join me, and I have some fun things as well. Enjoy the World Series. Best of luck, Dodgers and Yankees fans. Hopefully, it's a great series. Hopefully, it's fun. Whoever you're rooting for, God bless you. Those of us that are Met fans, we are already planning for next year, and our real World Series is whether we're going to be able to re-sign Pete Alonso and Sean Manaea. All right. Have a good weekend, everybody. I'll see you on the radio.